Hello, Mr. Yates. Thank you for coming to our festival.
That's a pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
I assume it's the first time when you talk with the Romanian audience.
Yes, it is. I have actually been to Romania before, but this is the first time I've talked about my book to a Romanian audience. Yeah.
Okay, let's roll. You have a PhD in mathematics at Oxford.
Yeah.
Do you remember the moment when you found yourself fascinated by science, and maybe the moment when you think that it's a possibility for you to become a scientist yourself?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I don't come from a family of scientists. My family more interested in English Language and books and art and things like that. So I'm sort of the only scientist in my family. When I was at school, I just really started to enjoy science and maths in particular. I felt that I could do it, and it was fun and interesting. And I liked the fact that in maths you generally came up with an answer which was correct, and often you knew when it was correct. And I enjoyed that. But yeah, I did science all the way up to the age of about 15, 16. I did physics, chemistry, biology, and maths. And then I had a little bit of a problem with biology because it became a little bit gruesome for me. You had to do experiments on, eyeballs and fish heads and things like that. And I'm a little bit squeamish. I don't really like that sort of thing. So one day I went into the lab and I basically passed out because there was this sort of fish head they were expecting us to dissect. And so I had to stop doing biology, which was a real shame because it was this fascinating subject, which sort of, gives you the insights into how life works. And I thought that was a real shame to have to miss out on that. But then, I specialized in sort of physical sciences and maths. And I went to university at Oxford and I read maths as an undergraduate. And actually, I was worried that I'd closed off this biology path. But what I found when I got to university was actually that maths is the language of science. And it actually gives you this ability to describe different sciences. It's the language that they speak. So you can, physics talks in maths, chemistry talks in maths. And actually, interestingly, people don't really associate the two of them, but you can model all sorts of biological situations using mathematics. And so I got this sort of enlightenment when I was an undergraduate that I could use the mathematics that I'd been learning to actually go back into biology from a more theoretical point of view, not having to do any cutting up experiments, but working with experimentalists to try and answer these fundamental questions about life. So yeah, it's been a real strange journey for me.
Well, do you remember as a kid what kind of books did you read? If there was any connections between the stories and, I don't know, this natural world or something like that?
I mean, I still read quite a lot, and I read quite a lot. I enjoyed, factual books, but I also really enjoyed fiction. And I think that has helped a lot with the way that I write. And similarly, my family being much more interested in literature than me would always recommend me good books to read. And I think that's rubbed off in the way that I write, because when I'm writing, for the maths of life and death, when I'm writing that, I'm not really writing science. I'm writing people's stories. I'm writing not fiction, but I'm dramatizing, if you like, these real life stories of people who've been impacted by mathematics. So I think, I always enjoyed, classic literature. I enjoyed, fantasy. So I also enjoy science fiction as well. But I think reading a lot of literary fiction has helped me hopefully tell some interesting stories. So in the book, those stories about Chernobyl and how exponential growth caused huge problems for the nuclear reactor in Chernobyl, and there's stories about people who have lost huge amounts of money in pyramid schemes because they didn't understand exponential growth. But what I've tried to do is tell the human story there rather than just make it about the mathematics. And I think that having read quite a lot of literary fiction over the years, that's helped with that.
So this is your first book. This is the Romanian cover.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's different than the British one.
No, it's the same. That's the same as the British hardback cover.
That's the same, right? So the math of life and death, why math? It's almost everything. It's not a math book, as you said, but tells several stories about life and death, in which math is essential. Stories about healthcare, finance, economics, businesses, politics, mass media, stories about artificial intelligence, data, statistics, algorithms. What was your approach to put together this kind of book? How did you gather all the stories?
Yeah, I mean, I really wanted to emphasize to people that maths is important and interesting and can be fun and exciting as well, but without, going into equations. I tried really hard to make sure there are no equations in the book, because I know that puts people off. And actually, in hindsight, I probably shouldn't have put maths in the title of the book, because I think that will put some people off, because it is about maths, but it's about the places where maths can have an impact without you even realizing it. So yeah, we tell the stories of parents who've lost children because of mathematical mistakes, or people who've been sent to prison incorrectly because there's a mathematical misunderstanding in the courtroom, or people for whom an algorithm tripped them up, or there's all sorts of stories. But that was the idea, was there are lots of places where maths is useful and important in our society without us maybe seeing it. It's under the hood. It's hidden behind the way that Google works. So it's hidden behind the way that, our sat-navs navigate us from one place to another. And we don't see it, but it's really important. And when it goes wrong, there can be drastic and dramatic consequences. So I was really looking out for these stories where maths has an impact. And for me, I see them perhaps more than other people do when there's a story about why people are misusing body mass, or people are using body mass index to tell whether people are obese or not. For me, I see the sort of mathematical story behind that. This is a quantitative measure that we have to use, but it doesn't work for everyone. In the same way that algorithms can let people down, this is a very simple algorithm or formula which lets people down, this body mass index formula. So, I often see in news stories where it doesn't appear at first to be about mathematics, but you dig under the surface and there's this whole mathematical context lying there underneath. So, for example, one example from last week, we had two politicians in the UK, Boris Johnson, who's the Prime Minister, and Nadine Dorries, who's the Culture Secretary. They tweeted out exactly the same tweet. And so naively, you might say, well, they have the same politics, they have the same ideas, so that's not that unsurprising. But actually, if you analyze it mathematically, how likely is it for two people to write the same tweet independently of each other? It's almost impossible. So it hints that they copied each other and potentially that their response was disingenuous. So where there doesn't appear to be mathematics, there often is mathematics underlying if you just know where to look for it. And that's what I've tried to draw out in the book, is that there are all these stories that do make the news often, but you just don't see the mathematics underneath it, partly because it's difficult to explain that mathematics. But that's what I've tried to do, is to make it easy to understand how the mathematics works underneath these stories.
But do you, as a mathematician, do you believe in coincidences and hazard?
Yeah, so I do. I think coincidences are really fascinating. But so this is interesting, because my next book, I've just finished my next book. It's called How to Expect the Unexpected. It's about predicting the future. And there's a whole chapter in there about coincidences. And coincidences that happen all the time. They happen surprisingly often. The real magic about coincidences is the fact that we spot them in the first place. It's the fact that, someone, notices their friend that they haven't seen for 15 years on the other side of a restaurant in the other side of the world. Whereas, they could have just been sitting in the next door restaurant and they never would have seen them. So for me, the magic is not that these things happen, but that we actually spot them and we see them. That's the really interesting thing. But, if given enough opportunities, enough chances, there's this thing called the law of very large numbers, and it suggests that unlikely things will happen. So, the lottery is a classic example. For you individually to win the lottery, it's incredibly unlikely, but most weeks someone wins the lottery, even though it's an incredibly unlikely event, because if there are enough people playing the lottery, then someone is likely to win. And so I think that's a nice way of thinking about it. There's all sorts of ways in which coincidences can happen, and they're exciting and fun. And the joy is really in in figuring out, the connections between them and noticing them in the first place. But there's no reason to assume some sort of supernatural phenomenon happened. We are too quick as a species to see a correlation between two things and assume that there's a causation underlying it. When someone picks up a phone and rings someone they haven't spoken to for a year, and the other person was about to do the same thing, people say, "Oh, that's spooky. That's synchronicity." But actually, often it's just chance, but it's nice to appreciate those things. But we shouldn't jump to conclusions when we see coincidences, and it's important in science as well that we don't get confounded by coincidences and draw the wrong conclusions.
So you basically are saying that there are way more coincidences around than we spot.
I think so. Yeah, exactly. I think it's happening all the time, and actually, it's just very few of them that we actually see. But that's the magic in seeing them, is that we actually spot them in the first place. Yeah.
Mr. Yates, can you shortly introduce to our viewers the 7 math principles that you say influences our lives?
Yeah. So there are the different chapters of the book are effectively these different mathematical principles. So I start off by looking at exponential growth and how we can misunderstand exponential growth and how quickly that things can get out of hand. And I think we've seen that extremely pertinently in the pandemic, where cases were growing exponentially at the start, and so were hospitalizations and deaths. And actually, in many countries around the world, we acted too slowly. We saw it growing slowly at the start, but mathematicians knew it was about to do this, and most people just assumed it would continue doing this sort of straight line. So yeah, that's the first chapter, is about exponential growth. There's chapters about algorithms and the place where the algorithms have in our society, in our increasingly quantitative society. More and more power is being divested to algorithms. And actually, we like to think of algorithms as these sort of non-human, non-biased machines that will do our tasks for us. But actually, the biases of the people who write the algorithms can be hard-coded into the algorithms. So we need to be careful about those. The very last chapter is about epidemics and mathematical epidemiology, which is particularly pertinent for today, because we're coming out of this pandemic. We need to be thinking carefully about what happens with the next pandemic. And so in the American version of the book, it's called How to Stop an Epidemic. There's a chapter about maths in the law courts and how very simple mathematical mistakes can land innocent people in jail, or the converse of that can free people who are guilty. There's a chapter about maths in the media, about how we can be manipulated by the media if we're not mathematically savvy, and it provides some sort of tips and tricks as to how you can spot a dodgy news story. There's chapters about false positives testing, which again has been quite pertinent in the pandemic. So yeah, there's all these different aspects that we cover, and I suppose I wouldn't highlight 7 particular things, but those are the 7 chapters that the stories are broken down into.
You published the book before the pandemic, and since you wrote a whole chapter about vaccines and the Andrew Wakefield phenomenon, the guy who started the anti-vaxxers movement, were you surprised what happened last year? Did you believe in the possibility? First, did you believe in the possibility of a pandemic, of a new pandemic in these times?
Yeah, I think so. Firstly, yeah, the pandemic, it was unusual, right? And it was unlikely, but it wasn't unexpected. People have been warning about the possibility of, in particular, a pathogen which jumped from animals into humans for a long time. And in fact, in the book, I talk about a pandemic being one of the potential emerging threats that the WHO has had, the World Health Organization has highlighted as a huge potential threat to humanity. And this was obviously written or published a few months before the pandemic actually happened. So it wasn't unexpected. we should have been really across the world better prepared for it. But because it hadn't happened in living memory, the last major global pandemic was the Spanish flu in 1918. We've had pandemics, but less severe ones like swine flu in 2009. But yeah, we should have been expecting it, I think, and we should have been better prepared.
You say at some point that if there is the possibility of the new pandemic, probably it won't be a new disease, but an old one that humanity experienced with other occasions. Was COVID a new disease or?
Well, so yes and no, in that we had experienced SARS, which was another coronavirus in the Far East, and we've also had MERS in the Middle East. So those are related coronaviruses. Of course, we've been living with 4 different strains of coronavirus in terms of common colds for a long time. This is a related disease, so it's in some senses not novel, but then its pathogenicity, its infection fatality rate, the number of people who get infected that will die is much higher, of course, than a common cold. It's much higher than flu, and that's what makes it such a serious disease. If we were going around and people weren't dying or getting seriously ill from COVID, then it wouldn't be a big deal if people were getting infected. But of course, with an unvaccinated population, we suggest about 1% of the population who get infected go on to die from COVID. So it's not an insignificant disease. That's huge numbers of people if you let the disease spread unbridled through the population. So in some senses it was a new disease, but in some senses it was also a very old disease, and some parts of the world, particularly parts of the world that handled their response better, had been pre-warned with SARS, a related coronavirus earlier in decades earlier.
As a mathematician, what did you learn during the pandemic? There were mostly confirmations of the things that you knew, or maybe suggestions for future theories?
Yeah, in some senses, there were confirmations of what we already knew. And a lot of the tools that I've described in the book, so calculating infection fatality rates or thinking about the basic reproduction number, which is the number of people that each infected person passes the disease onto when they're infected. These parameters were some of the most important things in the pandemic. And absolutely, a lot of the theory that was described in the book and a lot of the applications came to pass. But for myself, as a scientist, I think the main thing that I learned is the importance of speaking out and the importance of telling the public about the science that you're doing and that others are doing, because I think good, clear communication can make a real difference in the pandemic. And I think we should absolutely be advocating for policies that we believe are effective interventions against COVID. And so I've been part of a group called Independent Sage here in the UK, who've been offering independent policy advice to the government and also to the general public. And I think there's been this mantra in the UK that scientists should advise and politicians decide. But I think scientists should advise and advocate strongly for particular positions, so that we know, so the politicians who eventually do have to make the decisions know what we think is the right decision to take, rather than just throwing the model. We might build a model of what's going to happen and just putting those results out there. We need to provide them with context, and we need to control the narrative around our science. Otherwise it gets open to misinterpretation, and it gets open to misuse by exactly those people that you mentioned before, anti-vaxxers or anti-maskers, or people who would seek to manipulate your work if you don't put it out there with context. So I think it's really important that we as scientists speak out and advocate for policy and put our science in context, and don't just leave a vacuum there to be filled by misinformation.
Did the scale of the anti-vaxxers movement scared you a little bit? Were you expecting it?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that I was expecting it, given what we'd seen with things like measles, the MMR vaccine, and the scandal that Andrew Wakefield brought about. That he suggested that there was a link between the MMR jab and autism, and actually his research was fraudulent and the paper was retracted, and definitive studies on hundreds of thousands of children have shown there is no link between the two. But nevertheless, people lost confidence in that vaccine, and that allowed measles to recirculate to some degree. We never wiped measles out, but some countries managed to eliminate it. In particular, the UK, we managed to eliminate measles, which means that it wasn't continuously circulating in our population. But interestingly, so we managed to eliminate it in the UK in about 2016. A couple of years later, we lost that eliminated status, and that coincides with the time about 15, 16 years after the MMR scandal was at its peak, when those children who would not have got their vaccine back there had reached the age of about 18, 19, 20, when they were mixing, going to university, socializing more, mixing with each other. And it actually was largely younger people who were getting measles at that point. So actually, we saw this almost direct impact of this scandal. So when it came to COVID, we should have been expecting large anti-vax sentiment, particularly for a vaccine which was developed on a timescale which no one really thought was possible. So the reason, vaccines take a long time to develop, and the reason is because people often struggle to get funding for their vaccines, because it's often difficult to see the pharmaceutical companies to see how they're going to make money out of it. But with COVID, it was very clear that everyone in the world was going to want this vaccine immediately. And so people threw huge amounts of money at it, and the timescales got accelerated. So there's nothing dodgy or strange about the fact it was developed quickly. It's just the fact that usually it takes a lot longer, because not because the science is being done more rigorously, but because it takes longer to find the money. So yeah, I can see it was a natural point for anti-vaxxers to jump onto. But yeah, there's a lot of right-wing conspiracy theory out there about the fact that suggesting masks are not effective interventions. There's lots of disinformation. People stand to profit from being from spreading disinformation. So we need to try and tackle that as much as we can. But yeah, anti-vaccination campaigns, if that's what they can be called, coordinated campaigns, are really damaging. And yeah, we really need to try and put out good information. That goes back to what I was saying about scientists speaking out and being open and honest about their science, communicating directly with the public where possible to try to combat this misinformation.
Well, you teach and you write these wonderful books, but how can we restore the general public trust in science? Can we do that? Because it seems to me that we are quite a bit lazy and somehow quite ignorant, and we feel good this way. So it seems to be a lot of work to do this. How can we do it? Can we do it?
I think there's a problem that people would always like to hear comforting lies rather than inconvenient truths. And actually, as scientists, it's often our job to speak those inconvenient truths to the public and speak those truths to power as well. I think the reputation of science has been maligned or damaged to some extent throughout the pandemic, partly through governments suggesting that they were following the science, but actually only cherry picking the pieces of science that they really wanted to implement. And that's not really how we should be doing policy making. We should be doing evidence-based policy, but actually what often happens is we do policy-based evidence. We cherry pick the evidence which fits the policies we'd like to make. And that's not really a great way of making policy. So yeah, I think science has lost some reputation through its misuse by politicians. I also think that there's been a lot of scientific debate on social media, which would usually take place behind closed doors, vehement disagreements between scientists. And actually, I think it's sort of important for the public to know that that is part of the scientific process. We have to robustly challenge each other's ideas to make sure that that we're actually rigorously testing out what we're saying. Often it happens behind closed doors, so people don't see this process. But more recently, it's happened live on social media, and it's got quite heated in some cases. I think that's interesting. But again, it doesn't necessarily give the public lots of confidence in scientists when they see conflicting scientific views. It should give the public some confidence, though, to know that, this is how science works. We robustly challenge each other's views, and we don't just let people who have a reputation, say they've won a Nobel Prize in the past, define the whole of science. We have to base our science on evidence. We have to challenge each other about that evidence and about our scientific ideas. So in some senses, it's good. I think the best way to try to restore or to encourage public trust in science is to communicate with the public as directly as possible. So for me, writing books and explaining why mathematical modeling is important, how it works, the fact that, if you disagree with the assumptions of a mathematical model, then you should feel free to disagree with the conclusions. It's not set in stone. We have to make certain assumptions about the nature of reality to boil it down into a mathematical formalism, but people should feel free to disagree with those assumptions, and good mathematical modeling will always be upfront about the assumptions that are being made. So I think that, just trying to communicate through books, through, radio, through TV, as part of this independent sage group, we do weekly briefings, which are live on YouTube. We get out there and talk to people on Twitter as well, on other social media platforms. So really just being open and honest, communicating, and for me, trying to write books which hopefully people will read and enjoy and come away with a little bit of a better idea of what we do as scientists is the way forward to try to restore trust in what scientists are doing.
Well, speaking of social media, of feeling free to disagree, as a mathematician, do you think this can be a good option in social media to block the accounts, to erase the posts? Do you think it will work?
I think it's really difficult. So I think the problem is that what one person might define as misinformation, another person might not. I think there are clear, egregious instances when people are being abusive and when people are, clearly putting out information which is contrary to the majority or the vast majority consensus decision of science, like anti-vaccine propaganda, that we should be taking action to block people and to stem the spread of misinformation. But it's a really difficult one, and it's really hard to know where to draw the line on these things without trying to curtail people's freedom of expression and freedom of speech. So it's a really difficult one to know how to tackle, unfortunately. But certainly social media platforms are responsible for huge amounts of the dissemination of misinformation, and that misinformation has real life consequences because people choose not to be vaccinated with safe and effective vaccines against diseases which we could be wiping off the face of the earth, but we aren't, because we aren't getting high enough vaccine coverage. I'm not just talking about COVID, but I'm talking about other diseases there as well. So polio, for example, we're very close to wiping out, but we haven't quite got there. And so I think, if we can reduce the amount of misinformation out there, that's all for the good, but it's a difficult problem to tackle.
Well, going back to your book, The Math of Life and Death, I really enjoyed the stories behind your demonstrations and theories. For example, everybody knew about Archimedes going back, getting in the bathtub and then saying Eureka. But it was for the first time for me when I knew what he was searching.
Right.
Actually trying to measure the density of a gold that a crown was making, and that somehow was very, very
that's right
for me. I mean,
it's funny because like you say, it's a really famous story, but actually there's a really interesting sort of mathematical story behind it about the king comes to him and to Archimedes and says, I think this goldsmith who's made my crown has put fake metal in there. How do you figure out? And so, how do you work out the volume of an object which is not a regular object where we have a nice formula for it. And, the answer he came up with was to put it in water and to see how much water it displaced effectively. And that's what happened when he got in the bath. He saw the bath overflowing and had this literal eureka moment. So yeah, it's nice to bring those stories out and to put a bit of context to them. Yeah.
Did you get criticism from another scientist that probably were reading your book?
Yeah, well, I asked before I published it, I got lots of people to read the book for me. So my editors, I get my parents to read the book, because they are, like I mentioned to you, they're not scientists. So they're the sort of audience that I want to target, people who don't have much maths or science, but are interested in, the places where it can have an impact. I also had a couple of my former PhD colleagues who I did my PhD with to read it through and to fact check it for me to try and find the spaces. But generally, I think the reception to the book after it's been published has been quite positive. And I think people have enjoyed the fact that there aren't too many equations and that it's telling stories. And it's almost like sitting down to read something that's fun rather than sitting down to read something which is a boring science book, which is, I think, often the problem we have in popular science.
Well, maybe one last question for you, the teacher. How is the new generation of students? Did they restore your faith in humanity?
Yeah, I'm always really positive about my students in particular. I teach at the University of Bath. I'm a lecturer there. I teach mathematical modelling to these students. I teach them about how we model epidemics, and I'm always impressed with how interested and engaged they are, the quality of the work that they do. And so I think, if we get these people staying in science and staying in mathematics, then hopefully the future is bright, because these people are keen to do good with science. They're keen to understand the world around them using mathematics, and they're keen to use that for good. So I'm always the new generation. When I despair about the anti-vaxxers and the older people in society who rubbish science and say, this is not working, or the scientists got it wrong, I'm always looking to the next generation, the students that I teach, to see they inspire me with confidence that the future will be bright and that we will hopefully solve the biggest problems that we have in the world using mathematics and using science over the next few years.
Do you have a piece of advice for readers like me who weren't good at sciences in school and regret that now, but we really want, as we get older, to understand more and more of the complex world around? What should we do?
Yeah, so I think what I'm not advocating in the book is that everyone has to become a degree level scientist or a degree level mathematician. But what I am saying is that there are small things that you can do, little rules and tips and tricks that you can use to help you interpret a number in a newspaper headline, or to fact check a claim that someone's making, or when you go to the doctors, to ask them to explain the statistics for you. So it's not necessarily about learning the tools, but it's about having the confidence to question the people who are wielding the authority of mathematics, the authority that comes with numbers, and asking them, can you explain this to me? Because, this doesn't seem to make sense. And having the ability to just do the simple mathematics, which will help. And so I think part of it is not necessarily about learning maths or science, but it's about having the confidence to question the people who are the authority figures who are using these numbers. But in terms of going out there and learning, of course, reading popular science books and finding places that you're interested in, and then taking that further. There's lots of great online courses that are available nowadays that both universities and other institutions offer. And so once you decided that you really want to learn something, in a bit more detail after having read a popular science book, perhaps, then you can go out there and find some of these online courses that are offered by universities and take it a little bit further if you've got the time and the energy to do that. Yeah.
Mr. Yates, thank you again for your time. I'm certainly looking forward for your next book.
Great. Thank you.
Now, it should be easier for you to write the second one. I guess when you're writing the first one, you're a little bit
Yeah. Although the pandemic didn't help, having to homeschool my children, it's made it take longer. But yeah, certainly my writing craft is a little bit better now, I think.
And who knows, maybe that one will be also translated in Romanian, and we'll see each other again soon and speak more about mathematics of life and death.
I really hope so. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.